A few years ago, I worked at a small Italian restaurant as a busboy. It was busy, thankless, and it paid like shit. But it was work. I wasn't going to take that for granted. I'd gotten laid off during the recession, so I took what I could get. Anyway, I spent my breaks in the alleyway back behind the restaurant so that I could smoke in peace. Normally, the only company I kept out there was some bugs flying around, just off to the right of the door, and maybe a rat or two. If I was lucky, an alley cat would slink by, and I could kick an empty can or discarded bottle at it. The little things amuse you when your life consists of, washing dishes and clearing tables. This one night, I'm out there smoking a cigarette, and this wino comes staggering my direction from the far end of the alley. The guy reeked so bad I could smell him 30 feet away. He got within yelling distance and mumbled something incoherent. I dropped my cigarette and stomped it out, and I told the guy I didn't have any money, and I turned to open the door. Just before I went back to work, I looked at him and I sternly warned him to stay the hell out of the dumpster. I wasn't nice about it, and maybe I should have been, but I wasn't. Finally, my shift comes to an end, and I'm going to take the couple of bags of garbage out. I open the back door, set the 2 bags down, light up another cigarette, and head out to the dumpster. I just managed to open the lid when I heard a moan. I leaned over to my left, and I could see a pair of crusty-looking shoes. I shook my head and tossed both bags in before slamming the lid down. I went around the front to see the homeless guy was sitting there, propped up against the wall of the restaurant. I looked him over and asked if he was getting into our garbage. The guy just muttered and mumbled while dismissively waving his hand. I think he was telling me no, but for all I knew, this guy could have been trying to explain how those guys back in ancient Egypt made the pyramids. I was just about ready to leave when I decided to ask if the guy wanted a smoke. He looked up at me, and I could tell he wanted one. I pulled out a cigarette and gave it to him. He put it in his mouth and gestured his hands for me to come in and light it for him. Took out my lighter and, holding my breath, leaned in and lit it up. He took a drag and mumbled his way through a thank you. Then I told him he shouldn't sleep in this alley. There was a shelter a few blocks away, and I told him he needed to go there because they'd have a bed for him. He said something I didn't quite understand, and I waved him a good night, turned to go around to the street where my car was. As I was walking past the steps to the door, I heard something back down the alley, falling over. I stopped and turned around thinking it was another homeless guy, or maybe a cat or a raccoon or something. Maybe it had knocked over a garbage can. It was poorly lit, so I didn't really see anything. I waited for a second before flicking my cigarette and going about my business. I was almost out of sight when I swore I heard a growl or something. I glanced back over my shoulder, but in all honesty, by now, I was far too tired to really care. I went back home and took a shower. I had a beer and watched some TV and then went off to bed. The next day, I arrived at work to start my shift, and my boss, Angelo, started yelling at me about how when he showed up there was trash all over the alley by the dumpster. I cursed under my breath. Of course the homeless guy was going to go rummaging through the dumpster when I was gone. Why wouldn't he? I explained to him that there had been a homeless guy the night before, and that I had told him to go to the shelter after explicitly telling him to stay away from our trash. Angelo went off on some tirade about the homeless, and I just kinda tuned him out and got ready for the dinner crowd. When break time came, I went back out to my usual spot near the door to have a cigarette. There was still a bunch of garbage all over, and I could only shake my head. I was just about done with break when I heard a slow, shuffling noise just around the corner near where the dumpster was. Maybe my friend was back for more, I thought. I began walking, and when I got in front of the dumpster, I could see the alley was empty, save the tiny silhouette of a rat darting across the open space near the far end. I looked around at the mess, and when I saw something out of place, about 10 feet or so from the dumpster was a crusty-looking shoe. After a long, thoughtful drag on my cig, I decided to investigate a little. I walked over to the shoe, and I prodded it with my foot. It had been on its side, but I managed to nudge it enough that it flopped over on the sole. The thing was absolutely rancid and covered and caked in filth. I looked around again to see if maybe the guy was curled up in a dark corner somewhere. But at this point, he was just nowhere to be found. I began walking back and wondering if the guy was so messed up that he lost a shoe and didn't even notice. Just off to the side of the dumpster was a half-used cigarette. Looking at it drew my eyes to the side of the dumpster. I couldn't see that well, as it was dark green and the lighting was shit back there. But I could see that there was something darker smattered on the side. I moved in for a closer look. I didn't dare touch it. God only knows what nasty diseases I could contract from the mystery substance, to say nothing of the dumpster in general. While I was looking this over, I heard the door fly open and Angelo call out to me. I stood up and asked him to come take a look at whatever it was. He came over, angrily, and when I pointed out the dark splatter, he just shrugged it off and told me to get back inside and clear tables. I didn't think a whole lot about it during the rest of my shift. That kind of busy work tends to just push all complex thought out of your mind while you're doing it. At last, closing time was upon us, and I was doing the last bit of nightly cleanup. Like usual, Angelo told me to take out the last bit of garbage before I went home, and this time, he told me to make sure there weren't any dumpster diving homeless people waiting to rifle through it when we were gone. That night, it was one bag, so I grabbed it and made my way to the back door like I normally did. I opened the door, set the bag down, lit up a cigarette, and away I went. As I closed the lid, having deposited my bag into the dark abyss of the dumpster's insides, I mindlessly flicked the ash of my cigarette and I let out a sigh. I happened to look over to my right and I noticed something. The shoe was gone. Had Drunky come back for his shoe? Putting my cigarette back into my mouth, I went over to where it was. Just like before, there wasn't any sign of this guy anywhere in the alley. So I shrugged and decided I'd done enough for the night. I was just starting to pivot on my heel to leave, when again, I heard a shuffling from behind me. I glanced back, but I didn't see anything. There'd definitely been something there. I called out, "Hello?" But I got no answer. There's a little loading dock back there, where we get supplies and whatnot dropped off. sounded like it came from over there. But there wasn't a lot of light there because the dock lights were mostly burned out, and the one that was working had a covering so encrusted with dirt and grime. It wasn't much more powerful than an old lantern. I slowly made my way over to the docking area, and I squinted to see if I could make anything out. I really couldn't though. I decided to take out my phone and use the flashlight on it. I slowly shone the light over the dark spaces of the loading dock. Nothing. Not a single sign of anyone or anything. Whatever. I didn't want to waste any more time. I just moved my thumb to close the app, when yet again, I heard a low growl. My thumb froze, and I slowly brought the phone up. I scanned the area once again, and again, and again, and I saw nothing. Against my better judgment, I started moving further down the alley. Finally, I came to a spot where there was a storm drain. I immediately noticed two things. The grating was ajar, and the homeless guy's shoe was sticking out of it. I looked around quickly to see if anyone was around, and then I slowly walked towards it. At first, I just shined my light down the drain to see if I could catch a glimpse of anything. Was the homeless guy sleeping in the sewer? That would explain why he smelled so bad. But I couldn't see anything. I don't know why, but I reached down to pull the shoe out. Just as my fingers reached it, there was this weird hiss, and something shot out of the drain and grabbed my arm. I screamed, and I dropped my phone. My cigarette fell out of my mouth and bounced down my shirt as I pulled against whatever this was. When I looked to see what was clamped onto me, I saw what appeared to be an arm. The arm was pale and kind of scaly. The grip was so strong it felt like my arm was going to be crushed. In desperation, I clawed at it, but to no avail. And finally, I got up and stomped on the drain several times until the thing let out a yelp and loosened its hold on me. It was enough for me to rip free, but the thing's claws cut my arm pretty bad. I ran for my life back to the restaurant, yelling and screaming out of my mind. My boss and his wife were still there, as well as one of the waitresses. Angelo saw me and he started yelling about how I was bleeding on the floor. There was a lot of confused shouting as they were trying to figure out what was going on. His wife ushered me to the sink and started tending to my injuries, while Angelo continued to badger me about why I was bleeding all over his kitchen. I told him something grabbed me from the storm drain. I wheezed out about the homeless guy and his shoe and how I found it over there after I heard some noises. Angelo looked at me like I'd grown a second head. The waitress didn't say or do anything. She just watched in silence. I know what I was telling them didn't make any sense. At least Angelo's wife was kind enough to pretend to hear what I was saying. After things had calmed slightly, Angelo grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate the storm drain himself. He came back a few minutes later with my phone. He handed it to me and said the drain was covered. There was no scaly arm lunging out at him. Nothing. He laughed a bit and then told me I probably had run afoul of a cat or something. This ignored the fact that the cuts on my arm were too big to be a cat. His wife bandaged me up the best she could, and then they sent me home. I had the next day off and I went in to get my arm looked at and got some stitches. Upon my return to work, I discovered my late night encounter had become something of a joke among the staff. People were making wisecracks about this unknown creature, or asking me to tell the story to them with their huge shit-eating grins. Occasionally, someone would wait around the corner and lunge out at me or try to grab me. That stopped when I freaked out and hit one of the other busboys with a tray in the face, which, fortunately, Angelo never found out about. The fact that I wouldn't go near the back alley also seemed to amuse my co-workers to no end. I'd been ribbed and endlessly ridiculed about it 3 or 4 months. All the while, I was having legit issues stemming from what happened. I started having trouble sleeping and began to drink more. I got really jumpy, and sudden, loud noises sent me into panic mode. I got more irritable with people, which, at a job with a short-tempered, middle-aged Italian man running the show, could get interesting. I know the changes weren't unnoticed, but no one at work bothered to say anything about it. Even after the jokes had largely ceased, I wasn't any better. I flatly refused to go back out, even a full year later. It didn't matter that other employees had gone back there and not had anything strange happen to them. It didn't matter that Angelo put up a camera back there after we got broken into and it never captured any footage of something crawling out of the drain. I just wouldn't do it. Angelo, of course, thought I was being a baby, but he eventually gave up trying to get me to go back out there. I think, deep down, he knew something had to have happened. Even if he didn't believe in sewer monsters, something messed me up, and he knew that. In late 2019, Angelo had a massive heart attack, and he died. His son, Jackie, had tried to run the place, but he was never any good at it. The restaurant limped into 2020, just in time for the pandemic to deal at the death blow. We had been barely hanging on as it was since Angelo died, and the lockdowns ended the whole thing. I wasn't sad to have to find work elsewhere, truth be told. I got a different job and I tried to move on with my life the best I could. I didn't bring up what had happened that night to anyone but my sister. I know she didn't believe me either, but she at the very least tried to pretend to be supportive, because clearly I was dealing with some big problems. I had a nightmare about it just a few months ago, and she suggested I go back and face my fear. I was quite colourful in describing what I thought of that idea, but over the course of the next couple of weeks, I decided maybe I should do it. I went during the day. The restaurant was still closed up. No one had bought it yet, and likely no one will. I walked down the asphalt toward that drain. I'd be lying if I said I didn't need some liquid encouragement before going through with it. When my feet finally came to rest at the edge of the grating, I just stopped and stared into the darkness. There wasn't any noise. There was no homeless guy's shoe. There was just me in the drain. I stomped on the grating a few times. Nothing. Just nothing. I started to feel stupid about the whole thing. I lit up a cigarette and looked over at the alleyway. When I was done with it, I looked down at the drain and I scoffed and flipped the darkness off. I dropped my cigarette down between the space in the grating, and I watched as the cherry bounced off something halfway down. Something that hissed. My breath caught in my throat. I began bolting back toward my car, and I never looked back. Later, I called my sister. I told her I'd gone to the alley and that there wasn't anything there. She sounded so relieved that I'd been able to conquer my fear. I put on a pretty good show, I guess. After that, I purposely started talking to her less, so she wouldn't see that I'm still messed up. Functioning, but still messed up. I know she's suspicious that I'm still dealing with this, and has brought up therapy a couple of times. But I don't want to see a therapist. All they're gonna do is tell me I'm obsessing about some childhood BS, give me a prescription for pills. I don't know what the hell that thing was in the drain. I don't want to know. It's real. That much I can tell you. And I have good reason to believe it killed that homeless guy and tried to kill me. I've got the scars on my arm to prove it. That tells me all I need to know about it. I'm still skittish around storm drains, even when I'm out of town. Sometimes, I catch myself being paranoid to a ridiculous degree. Like the shower drain, or the toilet. Absurd stuff like that. It had a hold of me for maybe 15 to 20 seconds, but it's lived rent-free in my head ever since, and it's ruined me mentally and emotionally. So, listen up. If you're ever passing by a storm drain, maybe you hear a growling or a hissing sound or something that goes bump in the darkness, do yourself a favor and keep walking. Do not stop to investigate. It's just not worth it.